The sun was well over the horizon by the time the paladins finished at the temple, and the priestess bade them a safe journey to Iranthal. Outside, the sparse array of merchant stands in the town square remained unchanged from earlier in the morning. Along with the sight of the unfinished buildings and freshly painted walls that could be seen along the streets, it underlined how recent the charter of the settlement was. Near the middle of the square, a man in a vaguely familiar uniform sat astride a horse, turning his head about nervously. His gaze fell upon the group of paladins exiting the temple and he urged his mount towards them. "Is there a Captain Lorenzo here?" he asked. The paladins parted to allow Lorenzo to come through to the front, and he looked up at the stranger through bushy eyebrows. "I am Lorenzo," he answered. "Have you some business with me?" "Thank the gods," the man's relief was visible. "I thought I had gone blind and somehow missed your party on the highway." "Well, as you can see." "Yes, of course," the man said. "Please excuse my delay. I've come with a delivery, straight from the Iranthal Merchant Guild." Lorenzo looked to Marcus, and he shrugged in response. There was nothing concerning the Merchant Guild when it came to their orders. The captain looked back up at the rider. "We have heard nothing about any delivery," Lorenzo said. "I assume there is some sort of explanation that comes with it?" A confused expression washed over the rider's face for a moment, but he quickly composed himself and dismounted. Removing an expensive-looking leather case from over his shoulder, he stepped forward and bowed before the captain, holding the article out with both hands. "Compliments of Countess Clara Odelia Dale Corlin," he told them, as if the words were enough on their own. At the sound of the powerful noble's name, the contingent's chatter ceased, and all eyes were riveted on the leather case. Perhaps what had been impressed upon them by the priestess concerning the countess affected them more than Marcus had initially thought. Seeing that no one else dared to move, he stepped forward and retrieved the object held out towards them. It was lighter than it looked, and no sound issued from within as it changed hands. He turned it over as he examined it, finding a pair of clasps holding the lid tightly shut. Marcus looked to Lorenzo, who nodded, and his hands worked to open the case. He lifted the lid and, too late, he noticed that there was a thin film of some material sealing it from the inside as well. There was no time to ponder this, however, for his eyes were immediately drawn to the shimmering objects within. Strips of polished green metal were inserted into slots in the case, arrayed 4 by 9. Each gleamed in the morning sun, and he squinted at the slivers of light that entered his vision. Angling the reflection of the sun away, he removed a gauntlet and tucked it under his arm so he could fish out one of the objects within. As soon as he glimpsed what he had drawn out of the case, Marcus felt his jaw drop open. A mithril plaque lay in his hand, fitting comfortably within his palm. Over its shining surface was the mark of the Merchant Guild amidst artistic embellishments that could only be perceived as an intricate work of art. On the other side, was an emblem that matched those on the blue banners that fluttered beneath those of the Sorceress Kingdom, the sigil of House Corlin. Marcus did not think he would ever hold something like this in his entire lifetime. He looked back up at the man who had delivered the case, unsuccessfully keeping the surprise off of his face. "This is..." "They are marks of credit," the man said. "Valid with all members of the Merchant Guild, including those who only hold accounts with the guild." "But why?" Marcus fought to keep the stammer out of his voice. "There is one for each of us. Should one for all not suffice?" "They are each for your personal use. Countess Corlin desires that you want for nothing, and be spared of any inconvenience on your journey." A slender hand reached out from the side towards the open case and Marcus swatted it away. He handed the container of mithril plaques to Lorenzo. "Where should they be returned, once we have completed our journey?" the captain asked as he glanced down at its contents. "You can leave them with Bishop Austin at the Iranthal Cathedral," the man answered. "He'll send for an agent of the Merchant Guild." "Oh, don't worry if you lose them. They are enchanted and we can locate them even if you accidentally drop one into one of the rivers along the way. Please, feel free to use them while you're here. I'll be at the Merchant Guild branch office over there if you have any questions or concerns." He gestured over to one of the completed buildings facing the square. With a deep bow, he stepped back towards his horse and led it away in the direction of the office. The paladins gathered around Lorenzo. "What are you, a flock of pigeons?" Lorenzo muttered. "Form up. You have half an hour to figure out how these are used, and by the gods, if anyone comes back to the wagons looking like a cockatrice, I will pluck you myself." The paladins dispersed into the square and the open shops nearby after receiving their plaques, though most only picked up an early lunch from the market. Marcus stared down at his own, which had been accepted without question or pause. The vendor at the stall he chose to purchase his meal from turned overwhelmingly friendly at the mere sight of the thing. It was a degree of provision that Marcus had not experienced before. Paladins were well received wherever they went in the theocracy, and basics such as accommodations, stabling and simple necessities were provided by the temples. Even in far-flung rural corners of the nation, there was always at least a monastery that would shelter them. Putting together what coin he could before his departure from Altamura, he had wondered if they would even be afforded that much in this strange and foreign land. Instead, they were provided with the means to purchase whatever they wished for their journey. There was seemingly no limit attached to the plaques. They could stay at the finest inns and dine in luxury, purchase any supplies or services they might want for. Marcus thought he could probably purchase one of the spacious, newly built homes in the town with it, but he felt that he would be struck by lightning if he tried. Brother Marcus, Alessia continued to hover close to him even after being released to go shopping. I like these houses here. Do you think I could? Why did you hit me so hard? I am not wearing armor, you know. The gods must have driven my fist to smite a greedy little girl, Marcus replied lightly. You heard the priestess, yes? This Countess Corlin is said to be a shrewd noble, so this hospitality of hers may be a test for us. Alessia turned her own plaque in her hands, eyeing it suspiciously. She flexed the thin plate of metal back and forth, which unfailingly returned to its original straightness upon being released. I am curious of this Countess Corlin, she said as they walked back down the street to their wagons. She does not seem like the aristocrats from home. The townsfolk carry themselves very differently. Even the priestess could not stop singing her praises. As an orphan, Alessia probably did not have a high opinion of the theocracy's territorial administrators. Though the tenets of the faith addressed the issues and principles of rule, and the Inquisition ensured that any corrupt and decadent officials were dealt with as soon as they drew suspicion, the fact of the matter was that the land was not so bountiful that it could provide freely for all. The orphaned and impoverished relied on almsgiving and what the temples could afford them, which, if one were to be blunt about it, was barely enough to meet their needs. There were some who speculated that it was done on purpose in order to encourage a steady stream of entries into the priesthood and faith militant, which offered their acolytes and squires much improved living conditions. Marcus considered it a prudent allocation of resources, but he supposed that it ultimately produced the same result. Alessia was one such orphan who had been enticed onto this path, at the time not understanding that she had already been scouted as a promising entry to the Paladin orders. You take issue with the aristocrats at home? He asked. What I mean to say is that rarely do you see the common people think either way about them. Maybe you sometimes think this one is too greedy or the summer fair was nice this year, but the people here possess a disposition which is on an entirely different level. After one look at the crest on this plaque, I thought they might kiss it, then try to kiss me. Are you saying something else is going on? Marcus frowned as he considered the possibilities behind such behavior, an enchantment or some ability. Administrator abilities do not usually have such a pronounced effect on so many people. Through centuries of record-keeping and study, the slain theocracy understood that those who pursued civilian vocations, though not as directly apparent as combatants, manifested abilities related to their profession. Though anyone could pick up farming tools and try their hand at growing crops, professional farmers demonstrably produced more and were capable of several other things that proved impossible for those who were not. The same applied to miners, craftsmen and even administrators like nobles. Due to this realization, cultivating bloodlines, establishing institutions, and identifying aptitudes were all important aspects of the slain theocracy's governance and culture. The doctrines of the faith, too, supported this. Indeed, it was their religious teachings that laid the groundwork for their state. Adherence to the faith and the discoveries that it led to resulted in a nation that towered over its neighbors in both economic and military might. The nations of the north struggled with these ideas, and it was not due to the theocracy being selfish with what they understood. The great seeding carried with it what the slain theocracy knew at the time, yet this precious knowledge had been warped and twisted by presumption and selfish notions of entitlement, or cast aside entirely as foolish superstition. As the faith of the six waned in the north, so too did the people fall further away from these basic truths of the world. Still, It was entirely possible that Alessia's observation was caused by someone who had realized a new vocation or ability. If the lands bordering the slain theocracy adhered to the tenets of the faith, it was possible that such individuals might appear. Their identification would be of great interest to the chroniclers and researchers at home. It could be that this Corlin is all that the people here make her out to be, he mused. These lands near to us have close ties to the theocracy and have kept the faith. This noble might be one who has manifested her bloodline's potential, and if the blood of the gods flows through her veins. Alessia's face screwed up strangely. The chroniclers will faint if this is true. This is bad. No wait, is it good? I cannot tell. Marcus wasn't sure, either. Traces of divine blood were widespread in the theocracy, and it was something that was monitored very closely by the temples. If a child was even suspected of manifesting its potential, they were immediately whisked away to be groomed for future service to the state in a martial or magical capacity. In the north, where the temples of the Six lacked the same resources and authority, it was not impossible for someone like that to go unnoticed and be raised normally. With the tens of millions of humans in the northern nations, it was actually unlikely that it didn't happen once or twice in a generation, only to be squandered in ignorance. It is entirely possible, he replied, though the chances are extremely small. If the sorcerer's kingdom is as powerful as rumors suggest, however, they may have the knowledge to match. Perhaps they already know and have placed her over so many territories for exactly this reason. Even if she is not of divine lineage, she may have still awakened to some other bloodline. Or maybe it is a previously unknown vocation. Should we attempt to dispel magic on someone nearby and see what happens? Use of hostile magic on people and their property without permission or warrant is illegal everywhere I can think of, Marcus replied immediately. You might think that your suspicions may merit an investigation here, but remember that we have no such authority in this country. Besides, if an ability is the source, it probably cannot be dispelled anyway. After placing their things on one of the wagons, Marcus remained standing to work on the straps of his vambraces. What are you doing? Alessia looked down curiously at him. What does it look like? He replied, getting out of this before I miss my chance. The day is looking to be a hot one, and I do not want to be feeling like a pot of boiled socks by the afternoon. At least half of the contingent must be combat ready at all times, so riding in comfort is a limited opportunity. You are not worried about what lies ahead? Even if I was, there is nothing we can do about it without running afoul of the laws here. Doing so would result in the failure of our mission, so I will give my horse an easy time and have a relaxing journey. Alessia hopped back out of the wagon to help him with his armor. She was his squire before her ordainment, so the familiar routine had everything off and packed away in short order. I thought you did not like feeling like a squire again? Duty to my fellow man, yes? Marcus smiled to himself lightly and climbed into the back of the wagon after her. To his surprise, the seats at the front of the wagon bed were well cushioned and comfortable. He felt himself sink slightly into place, unable to feel the wooden base of the seat. You made this sound like an imposition rather than a luxury, he raised his eyebrow at Alessia. I said nothing about the wagons, she gestured around her, only all these old lumps of cheese. 15 minutes later, they rolled out of the bordered town and Marcus felt that their journey had finally begun in earnest. Though the highway was paved, it had not seen maintenance in recent years, yet he couldn't feel the wagon moving over it. The sound of the wheels rumbling over the cracks and mossy bumps could be clearly heard under them. He leaned over to examine the undercarriage. Driver, he asked, what enchantments does your wagon have? Suspension, axles and wheels, the young teamster replied without turning around. The tongue and harnesses as well. Just plain old cushions on the seats, though. Carriages in the theocracy had these conveniences commonly enough, but they were rarely found on cargo wagons. His estimation of the reportedly backwards nations of the north shifted somewhat. Maybe it was yet again due to the mysterious noble who ruled here. Are these wagons the property of House Corlin? No, the man pointed to the sigil on the wagon ahead of them. We're all hired from House Wagner. Countess Corlin's been moving her tenants and their things all over the place for the last few months. There's more than 100 of our wagons working out here. 100 enchanted wagons? Marcus furrowed his brow. For the common folk? Is this normal in the sorceress kingdom? They're not all enchanted, the driver chuckled. Only the ones that people are using to get around, or those transporting high-value cargo like enchanted items for all the villages. The ones hauling construction materials and the like don't need to be so fancy. Just to be sure, how large is Corlin County? Everything from the border with the theocracy to Eat Ranthal, and everything between the foot of the border ranges you see up there to the west, all the way to Katsa Plains. The whole of the Riverlands, except for the bit in the theocracy, of course. And the undead from the Katsa Plains do not cause any problems? Alessia asked. Not since we became part of the Sorceress Kingdom, the driver shrugged. The stupendous wealth and power of Countess Corlin became ever more apparent. The finances and connections to move tens of thousands of people around at will in comfort and perfect security. The wealth to provide magical items to what must be hundreds of rural communities across her domain. Chartering an entire town with stone walls and construction at the same time that this was all happening. Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat that formed as he continued to think. If this was what the newly enfeoffed Countess could bring to bear, then just how much greater was the Sorcerer King who could grant such authority to a single person with no worries. He didn't even know where to begin imagining it. The undead, Alessia piped up again. When can we see them? This isn't a sightseeing trip, you. He wanted to scold her, but it wouldn't have taken back Alessia's question. Marcus quickly glanced to the wagon bed near her seat. The haft of her warhammer was conspicuously sticking out of a bag nearby. He looked out and around at the fields to either side of the road, but all he could see were vineyards, orchards and the occasional labor attending to them as the paladins ascended the northern slope of the valley. They're not used for agriculture here, the man smirked, so you won't see them unless you get really close to people's homes. The first ones you'll probably see will be around the next new village. Close to people's homes? What the hell? It was the last thing that a native of the Riverlands would have liked to see. The next village. Alessia turned her gaze ahead of them. How many new villages have been raised? One for each leg of the trip on this highway. Well, Corlin Harbor's more like a large town than a village. That's the last stop before Ranthal. Marcus rubbed his head while he realigned his perceptions. Rather than simply being a powerful countess, Corlin was more like a duchess, or maybe even a queen. Who else had the resources to do so much at once? If this is so, Alessia's eyes gleamed, we will have a soft bed and a roof over our heads every night. Fresh and hot meals as well. That's right, miss, the teamster nodded. This highway's a merchant stream. A quality place to stay every night, and all the services one might need on every leg of the route. There's no hostile monsters or bandits. The road itself's being expanded and improved on as well. Even with everything that's being built, the tolls are unexpectedly light. The young woman's disposition softened greatly with the driver's confirmation. Marcus wondered what sort of luxuries she was imagining with such a loose grin on her face. They continued on their way, over the crest of the valley and into the next. Around mid-afternoon, after crossing the next river and ascending the opposite side of the valley, the procession halted abruptly, causing the driver to curse while he worked to settle his team of horses. What in the bloody hell? The teamster muttered as he craned his neck to look up the road. Marcus and Alessia looked forward as well, but their view was obscured by the line of wagons ahead. The driver stood in his seat to see what was going on. Almost immediately, he sat back down with a darkening expression. Should have put one of the wagons in front, he grumbled. His words made no sense to Marcus, but he could see Alessia already reaching out for her weapon. In the tense silence, a distant canter of hoofs and the rumble of wagon wheels floated in from somewhere ahead of them, followed by the nervous whinny of a horse. Marcus furrowed his brow. Why would a column of veteran paladins stop for a wagon? Shouts of alarm came from the front, followed by the captain's voice, issuing orders to stay in formation. A feeling of dread washed over Marcus, and he heard Lorenzo's voice ring clearly through the air. Lion's Heart. The voices of the other paladins casting the spell in turn rolled towards them. Lion's Heart. Alessia cast the spell on herself, and she looked to Marcus worriedly. Lion's Heart. As his own spell washed over him, he felt the sense of trepidation vanish. His mind worked to make sense of what was happening. Something powerful was coming, strong enough to convince the captain that under Divine Flag was insufficient to provide suitable resistance to fear effects. He adopted instead to use a single target enchantment that provided complete immunity. Marcus battered away his regrets over putting away his equipment as he searched through the wagon bed for another weapon, but it had all been tidily put away and he could not distinguish between the plain-looking satchels. The sound of the hooves was almost upon them, and he could discern several separate animals out of the noise. Still, he focused on trying to arm himself, opening pack after pack. Just in time, he finally found another warhammer and snatched it up to stand and face the unknown threat approaching. It wasn't long until their adversary made its appearance. Or rather, it sped by without so much as a word. 6 driverless wagons rolled past them, laden with stone, gravel, lumber, and wooden crates. Each was drawn by a skeletal horse wreathed in billowing mist and emanating a sickly yellow light. Several riderless war horses in the paladin's procession panicked and broke free of their lines, running off of the road and into the nearby orchard. Someone shouted in warning and several members of the contingent rode after them. Ah! With warhammer in hand, Alessia looked like she was about to jump off of the side of the wagon in her stockings. All that remained to swing at, however, was a cloud of dust. Her sentiment was mirrored by several nearby, coughing and looking similarly confused. Even Marcus had placed a boot on the edge of their wagon, in anticipation of a violent struggle. After scanning their surroundings, he reseated himself and found that the driver had turned in his seat, looking at them as if they had all gone completely mad. Those couldn't have been Soul Eaters, could they? Marcus asked, trying to ignore his look. The man turned back to face forward with a sigh. Yep, he replied. You mean those spoken of in the City of Silence story? Alessia looked down at him from where she was still standing. Well, I can't personally vouch for the ones in the Silent City, but that's what they call these. So 2 Silent Cities worth of Soul Eaters just trotted by pulling wagons? The young paladin peered off down the road where the skeletal horses had disappeared. I suppose? The man frowned. They're a pretty common sight around here. A common sight, Marcus parroted the man flatly. Yeah, there's a few hundred of them working around the Sorceress Kingdom, including most of those wagons hired from House Wagner that I talked about. Normally, we'd be using them too. A few hun. Are you saying it is common to see a Soul Eater pulling a wagon in the Sorceress Kingdom? That's right. The Central Administration's trying to encourage the use of Soul Eaters for internal logistics, while caravans going beyond the borders or dealing with outsiders like yourselves still use regular draft animals. Seeing what just happened, I'm sure you can understand why. Best get used to them if you plan on staying here long, or it might be a bit embarrassing in a place with more people watching. The runaway horses were returned and Marcus could not help but be irked at the idea that their war horses, which had been trained face down demi-human hordes and swarms of the undead, had bolted while the draft horses pulling the wagons did not seem to care at all. Several minutes passed before they finished retethering their mounts and the column resumed its journey north. Are there any other surprises like that? Marcus asked. It's not a surprise when it happens all the time, but I guess there are a few things that you might consider. 1. The man reached down to pull a flask out from under his seat. There should be undead up in the town up ahead, skeletons mostly used as menial labor. I can't think of any time that they've been attacked, but it's legally considered property damage and you'll have to pay compensation or face jail time. There's elder liches, too. The ones flying overhead are usually on patrol, while the ones on the ground are out doing office work. Elder liches, as clerks? Alessia's face screwed up in confusion. You'll find them in every administrative office. The driver wiped his mouth after taking a long draught from the flask. Rantle has hundreds of them. They're usually quick and no nonsense about their work. The last bunch of undead you'll see are the ones working security, death knights, death warriors and the like. It's death knights that you'll see the most since they're supposedly the defensive type. The others you can find here and there. There's death warriors on the bridge to Corlin Harbor and death cavaliers performing patrols around the border. There's even a crew of undead running a ship between Corlin Harbor and Warden's Vale. I think I will be crazy by the end of this, Alessia complained. I do not think I can seriously harm a death knight yet, so can I just hit them to satisfy myself? The man eyed her strangely before speaking again. I can't say I've ever seen anyone do that, he said, putting the flask away, but I wouldn't recommend it. They tend to interpret the criminal code quite severely, so you might get dragged off somewhere. MMH. Alessia glowered down at her feet, and Marcus changed the topic. It's getting late in the afternoon, he said. How far are we to the next village? You should be able to see it from here. The driver peered up towards the ridge. Ah, there it is. A few of its towers are poking out over there. Marcus' gaze followed the curve of the highway until he saw what the man was speaking of. Battlements fashioned out of grey stone rose over the distant horizon, catching the afternoon light. At their current pace, they were still a few hours away. This village was raised before the one at the border, the driver told them, so you'll be able to enjoy everything a proper stop has to offer. Despite how far away they still were, Alessia quickly put her warhammer away and pulled out her mithril plaque. Her eyes scanned the wagon bed before she reached out and tugged her boots out of her baggage. An air of excited anticipation oozed off of her, the encounter with the Soul Eaters apparently cast by the wayside. Marcus could only roll his eyes. As Marcus had surmised, it took a few more hours to arrive at the town, the halfway point between the Theocracy border and Corlin Harbor, according to the wagon driver. The sun was disappearing behind the mountains that loomed to the west by the time they rolled through the gatehouse. Alessia had her mithril plaque in hand the entire way, and Marcus could swear she was bouncing on her chair in excitement. As the driver had mentioned, this town was still also under construction, but appeared far ahead of the border town. Its walls and towers were mostly completed, while the structures that could be seen peeking through the gaps were already occupied. Unlike the border town, it was built off to the side of the highway rather than straddling it. Marcus wondered why that was. Fortified settlements were the main way to regulate the use of a nation's vital highways. Coming up to the open gate, they found it manned by human militia in much the same fashion as they were stationed on the border. Unlike the previous settlement, however, they were quickly waved through once the proper paperwork and credentials were provided to the customs office. The driver steered the wagon towards an open area that was set out of sight of the main streets, and Marcus looked around for potential accommodations. I guess we will need to find a merchant inn with room enough to stable our animals first, he mused to no one in particular. Driver, do you have any recommendations? No, there's no need for that, actually. Each of these villages was chartered and designed with trade and local industry in mind. A quarter of the village is set aside for servicing caravan vehicles and their animals, so there's no running looking around for the right accommodations. Another quarter of the village is for warehouses and other storage buildings. There are no issues with theft or privacy doing it this way? Marcus asked. Not really, no, the driver answered. If anything, it's better on that front since the local authorities can provide security for everything in one place. The method is rather simple, you'll see it in a minute here. The site they pulled into was effectively a large yard, and Marcus immediately understood what was being done. The space was drawn up into lots with the space for wagons and stabling for draft animals. Sets of lots were allocated depending on the size of the caravan, then partitioned using heavy tarps that served as both dividers and shelter. There were permanent fixtures set out to accommodate all the possible configurations that might be required. There was even plumbing and proper drainage for the places where the animals were to be kept. This is a new thing, Alessia said. Not exactly, the driver said. The trade cities in the Great Steppes beyond Carnassus have been doing this for as long as anyone can remember. There've been some modifications made for human convenience. Human convenience? Marcus looked at him sharply. You mean to say that something else came up with this? Yep, the driver nodded. It's the way that the Centaur tribes out in the east set things up when they visit the cities on the steppe. I suppose if you have the body of a horse, you're going to spend a lot more time thinking about this sort of thing than a human. To be honest, what they have is a lot fancier, but this'll do for our caravans. You have been there yourself. I haven't crossed the entire steppe, that place goes on forever, but I've been about halfway. There's a string of cities that goes straight through to the nations on the other side. After we are done here, I think I'll be off on my 8th caravan out there. House Wagner must have powerful merchant guards to survive such a journey. Not really. The Great Steppe is dominated by the Centaur tribes. They're the ones that keep things safe enough for merchants to ply their routes. Merchant guards would have absolutely no chance if they had to fight a Centaur patrol. Alessia stopped looking around, turning her attention to the driver with a frown. I have heard many stories about the centaurs of the steppe and how they raid the city-states of Carnassus, she said. Of the equestrian king, who has grown in power and aggression. Yet you claim to have traveled into the Great Steppe many times. Are these stories merely unfounded rumors? I don't know all of what you've heard, the driver replied, but what you said about the Equestrian King is true. All of the cities that border the Great Steppe have to deal with the Centaur tribes. Some fight, some pay tribute, there are a few strong enough to not be worth raiding. Then how? The world is a big place, miss, the driver told Alessia. Most of it ain't like this part of the world where humans live. Hell, most of Carnassus isn't even human. Sure, race plays a part in how people see you, but it's not like Slane or Roble or Eastis where people have it in their heads that the world is divided between humans and everyone else. You folks from the theocracy might think that the Sorceress Kingdom having many races as citizens is strange and unnatural, but I'll tell you straight, there are more places in the world like the Sorceress Kingdom than there are like the theocracy. But the races out there eat humans, Alessia protested. They have kept humans as chattel and raided our homes since the dawn of recorded history. Humanity was driven to the edge of extinction mere centuries ago. I won't argue with what you believe, the driver said. I can only tell you what I know from my own experience. There are countless races in the world, it's pointless trying to divide humans and everyone else, and no one really does that out there. It's more like everything is a calculation, people balance risk and reward, no matter what race they are. Any ruler with an ounce of sense understands the value of trade. Merchants bring prosperity, ideas and information. We pay tolls and tariffs. We do this willingly, at no cost to the places we visit. Rather than raiding merchant caravans, those in power do everything to ensure that the caravans keep coming. House Wagner has people that have gone as far as the nations of the Beastman Confederation, and they return safely as long as they follow the laws of the places that they visit. Marcus, Alessia, and the paladins nearby fell silent at the driver's words. The notions that he conveyed were so alien that Marcus had no idea what to think. They watched in silence as the wagons were parked, their animals stabled, and the partitions in the yard were raised. As the caravan members and nearby militia finished up securing the premises, the paladins gathered in front of Lorenzo again. It would be nice if there is a place with room enough for all of us, he said, but I would like for us to split up into groups regardless. Try to keep your parties small and go out to get a feel for this settlement and its people. The gods know we have found ourselves in a strange place, and we must learn quickly. You men have traveled the length and breadth of the theocracy, and even some of the world beyond. Your experience is why you have been chosen, so it is time to put it to work. The paladins stood about for a while as they discussed what to do between themselves. Lorenzo moved amongst them, answering questions and reiterating their expected behavior. A half-hour later, only Marcus, Lorenzo and Alessia remained. Are you sure you want to hang around a couple of uncles on your stay? Marcus asked the young female paladin. You were so excited that you looked about to jump out of your seat on the way here. I know no one among the rest, she frowned. Unless you mean to send me away on my own. Both hailing from Altamura, and she being formerly his squire, they had naturally stuck together on the trip so far. Unfortunately, it also seemed that the others had marked him as her caretaker or something along those lines. Despite being a talented paladin, Alessia was still 6 years from being considered an adult in their eyes, so leaving her alone would surely create a bad impression. I fear that some catastrophe would befall us if you were left to your own devices, he grumbled. You are welcome to come, but do not complain of boredom when you do. You are not planning on finding some tavern to drink the evening away, are you? Marcus exchanged looks with Lorenzo. That was precisely what they did whenever they met again after a long while. They would share new tales of their campaigns and tours around the border, reminisce over the memories that they shared, and toast the memories of comrades long gone. He supposed that, in her shoes, he would consider it all boring, or perhaps lonely since there was nothing for her to add. At that age, he certainly didn't appreciate the value of such meetings. Was there something you wanted to see, Sister Alessia? Lorenzo asked. The driver we rode with said that there are undead here, she answered. I would like to see what sort of business they are up to. Marcus involuntarily glanced to her waist to see if she had brought any weapons with her, but all that hung there was a purse and dagger. She probably didn't intend to cause any trouble. Then again, the driver did mention that skeletons were being used. Even if she were completely unarmed, Alessia had many ways to easily dispatch weaker undead with a single blow. An image of the girl leaving behind a trail of shattered skeletons while waving the mithril plaque around to pay for all the damage that resulted formed in his mind. Humph, Lorenzo huffed. It seems you two have been chatting the day away while I was stuck at the head of the column in this mithril oven. Perhaps we should trade places tomorrow. Really? If you put Alessia at the head of the column, Marcus snorted, she would have probably charged off after those solitas. So they were really solitas. I was certain that they were, but I was also certain that I was dreaming. That is what our driver said, Marcus replied. You did not ask? I was trying to pretend that it was a figment of my imagination, Lorenzo said, and the woman driving the lead wagon was glaring a hole into my back after all that. I wanted to invite her for a drink here, but alas. I cannot believe we ended up with this captain, Marcus sighed. You are one to talk, Lorenzo groused. Remember what you said about Queen Auriculus the first time we... Where do you think we should head first, Sister Alessia? I recall it being said that the undead are employed in menial labor, so how about these walls being finished? They turned away from the brightly illuminated town square and headed west to the nearby gatehouse where they had last seen portions of the wall under construction. What is Queen Auriculus like, Captain Lorenzo? Alessia asked as they strolled along. A girl just a bit younger than you, he replied. Brother Marcus was quite taken with her. Alessia moved over to the opposite side of the captain. Do not say misleading things, you. Marcus nearly shouted. It was the appearance that she assumed when she received us for the private dinner after the audience. You know, the womanly one with the, what? Nothing, Alessia replied lightly. The corner of Lorenzo's mouth twitched. I do not see what is wrong with that, it is. He cut off his voice at a familiar sensation, and they stopped where they were crossing the pavement. Brother Marcus, this is. His hand went up to touch the badge that clasped his mantle. It was a magic item that notified the wearer of an undead reaction within 40 meters. Every paladin stationed along the Katza border was issued one, and while it did not see much use inside the plains where one would receive a reaction everywhere the mist was, it was exceedingly useful when patrolling the border. The multitude of cavalry patrols out of the fortress would fan out to form a wide net that swept over the land, swiftly pinpointing any undead that wandered outside of the cursed land. Where is it? Marcus glanced around, but could not see anything that resembled undead. Alessia paced back and forth for a few steps over the pavement. She suddenly turned and jogged away up a side street. Marcus and Lorenzo followed after her, turning one corner, then the next. Alessia let out a startled yelp around the corner, and Marcus rounded the building, fearing what he would find. He was not sure what to make of it when he saw her, though. Bent awkwardly to avoid a collision, Alessia stood before, around, a girl appearing half her age. The girl was carrying a split log in her arms, and behind her was a skeleton that held several more. I am so sorry. Alessia stepped back before she lost her balance and fell over the girl. Are you all right? The girl looked up to her and nodded silently. Alessia breathed a sigh of relief, then her breath caught when she noticed the skeleton in the shadows beyond. Alessia's hand extended towards the girl. A piece of wood was thrown at her in response. Mama! The girl shouted as she ran away. The skeleton ran off after her, and Alessia was left holding her hand out in the empty street. She had a thoroughly confused look on her face as she stared at the retreating figure. Marcus cleared his throat. What? Alessia asked. Alessia, Marcus answered, what in the world are you doing? The skeleton, she stammered. I saw the skeleton and reached out to pull the girl behind me. And what is that in your hand? Alessia looked down and saw that she had drawn her dagger from her belt. It was a reaction, she cried defensively. I was trying to defend the girl from the skeleton. Beside them, Lorenzo put a hand on his waist and scratched his temple with the other. Alessia sheathed her dagger and leaned forward to rub her shin. She hit me with the corner of that thing. Do the citizens here train in throwing firewood? That was a skeleton warrior, wasn't it? Tell me I have not finally gone mad. It was, Marcus told her. Why is a skeleton warrior following a little girl around carrying firewood? Is she actually a deceptively young-looking cleric? That would mean she is quite the accomplished cleric, Marcus smirked at the idea. Rather than that, it should have been the menial labor that was mentioned, no? I was expecting something a bit less strong. Alessia muttered, maybe weak ones placing stones on the wall or driving nails, not skeleton warriors helping little girls do their chores. If every child gets a skeleton warrior in this country, they could just go invade the Beastman Kingdom for fun.
I do not think they share in your idea of fun, Marcus said.
Maybe they dress them up?
Lorenzo offered.
Alessia scowled up at them,
straightening to look around the street.
Her fingers played idly over her clasp.
The girl is long gone, she said, but there is still a reaction. I am guessing we do not need to go to the wall to find more undead.
She walked away, glancing through windows and doors as she went. Hopefully, she wouldn't be reported as a thief. As they went deeper into the common area of the town, the undead reaction continued without pause. Marcus finally deactivated the clasp, deciding it was about as useless here as it was within the Katsa Plains. Within a short distance, they came across several other children using skeleton warriors, and Alessia walked by with an overly friendly expression on her face. After passing by several shops, they encountered another group of the contingent's paladins watching a blacksmith at work. They exchanged glances, but could only shake their heads at the sight. A pair of skeletons in the back were pumping the bellows of the furnace without pause, while the blacksmith worked at the anvil. After a minute, Alessia spoke. "This is unexpectedly disappointing," she said. "I'm making nails, girl," the blacksmith returned.
"If you're looking for entertainment, maybe you should go to a tavern."
She was referring to the undead
you have over there,
Lorenzo said. "We heard that they are employed for various forms of labor,
but we were not sure what to expect."
"How long have you been using these skeletons for?"
"Around 3 weeks, the blacksmith replied between sets of hammer blows.
"Have you experienced any difficulties with them?"
"Not once I figured them out." "How about, incidents that you might expect with other undead?"
"No," the anvil rang. "Will you be replacing them with humans in the future?"
"No," the anvil rang again.
"What about apprentices? A shop such as this surely has a few."
The blows against the anvil paused.
"I'm going to have to ask you fellows to clear the way." The blacksmith pointed his hammer in their direction.
"One of those apprentices has been trying to get by you for a while now."
Marcus turned to find a boy carrying 2 buckets of charcoal on the street behind them. He, too, had a skeleton warrior following him around carrying the same load. The paladins parted and he skirted by them, emptying the buckets into half-empty crates. The skeleton followed suit, and the apprentice started to refill the furnace. Marcus felt a tug at his sleeve.
"We should go," Alessia said from beside him.
"I am feeling that we will see plenty of this from now on."
Marcus had the feeling she was right.